Welcome to Quicksand, the most important news in pharma and biotech this week. The FDA finalized guidance on how drug makers should study the effects of their drugs on driving ability. The guidance is largely in line with the draft version issued in 2015 and continues to recommend that drug makers follow the tiered assessment approach detailed in a 2011 report from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's Office of Behavioral Safety Research. FDA first introduced the draft guidance after issuing safety alerts over concerns that certain sleep medications, such as Ambien and Lunesta, could cause impaired driving the next day. The tiered assessment approach recommended by FDA consists of a pharmacology toxicology review, epidemiology review, and a clinical standardized behavioral assessment. According to FDA, drugs intended for chronic or chronic intermittent outpatient use are the most likely to require driving studies, while drugs meant primarily for pediatric or inpatient hospital use would not need driving studies. When driving studies are needed, FDA says those with actual vehicles or driving simulators can be used, though sponsors should weigh the advantages and disadvantages of either type of study and discuss any concerns with the appropriate review division at FDA. While the guidance is focused on psychoactive drugs, FDA says that drug makers need to consider effects that could impair driving for non-psychoactive drugs as well. For instance, FDA says that patients could experience impaired consciousness as a result of a hypoglycemic reaction from glucose-lowering drugs or blurred vision from mydriatic eye drops. Though the approaches for evaluating driving ability may differ for psychoactive and non-psychoactive drugs, FDA says the approach should be selected based on drug-specific effects. The FDA finalized guidance on developing antiviral drugs for recurrent herpes labialis, or RHL, commonly referred to as cold sores, which affects between 20% and 40% of adults in the U.S. Specifically, the guidance details FDA's expectations for drug makers to develop and test antiviral drugs to treat or prevent RHL from preclinical pharmacology and toxicology considerations to recommendations for designing Phase 2 and Phase 3 clinical trials. While FDA has approved some antiviral drugs to treat RHL, such as Dinavir and Famvir, the agency has not approved any drugs to prevent the disease. According to FDA, the final guidance is largely the same as the draft version issued in July 2016, with minor editorial changes and the omission of a requirement for a toxicity adverse event grading scale. In the draft version, FDA said that sponsors should provide a toxicity grading scheme for clinical trials with the understanding that toxicities with a relatively low-grade assignment may be less acceptable in healthy populations commonly enrolled in RHL clinical trials compared to populations in clinical trials of drugs for diseases such as cancer or human immunodeficiency virus. In the guidance, FDA says that sponsors of investigational drugs for RHL will need to undergo standard Phase 1 safety studies, followed by proof of concept and low dose-ranging Phase 2 studies, which FDA says can be of similar design to Phase 3 studies. FDA says that sponsors developing investigational drugs for RHL will typically need to conduct 2 Phase 3 superiority trials, though in some cases a single persuasive and clinically meaningful study for each indication, treatment, and prevention submitted together may provide substantial evidence of effectiveness sufficient for approval of both indications. The FDA released a draft guidance for consultation on a revision to the International Council for Harmonization guideline on reproductive toxicity testing. The draft ICH guideline, Detection of Toxicity to Reproduction for Human Pharmaceuticals, was endorsed by the ICH Assembly in August and is currently in Step 3 of the formal ICH procedure as participating regulators hold public consultations on the guideline. Specifically, the draft guideline discusses considerations for drug makers when developing a testing strategy for identifying and characterizing the reproductive risk posed by a drug. The guideline says that drug makers should generally provide data from adult animals exposed to a drug and assess the drug's impact on all stages of development from conception to sexual maturity. But the guideline notes that flexibility in testing strategy is warranted, as it is impossible to cover all possible scenarios in a single guideline. FDA also says the draft guideline includes additional clarifications on the qualification and potential use of alternative assays to test for reproductive toxicity. But as FDA notes in the Federal Register notice announcing the consultation, the list of compounds identified in the draft guideline is not complete, and as such, the agency says it is specifically looking for comments on additional compounds that could be added. Health data giant Quintiles IMS has changed its name to IQVIA. From November 15th, shares will trade on the New York Stock Exchange under the new name and new ticker symbol IQV. IMS was formed last year following the merger of IMS Health and healthcare consultancy Quintiles, a deal which valued the combined company at $17.6 billion. This merger created one of the world's largest portfolios of healthcare information, therapeutic, domain, regulatory, and commercial analytic expertise, as well as proprietary technology applications. The company's client solutions are powered by what will now be known as IQVIA Core, giving clients access to its healthcare information source, advanced analytics, technologies, and industry knowledge across diseases, geographies, and scientific methods. The new brand was unveiled on the back of a strong third quarter at the CRO. Its revenues for the quarter was $2 billion, growing 4.8% compared to the same period last year, and acquisitions contributed about 1.5 percentage points to that growth. A recent study found that 45% of marketing authorizations granted in the EU from 2012 to 2016 were based on evidence from a single pivotal trial. The authors of the study from Danish drug maker Lundbeck say they found the figure to be surprisingly high, but in line with findings from a recent study of FDA approvals from 2005 to 2012. Despite the high overall figure, the authors found the approvals based on a single pivotal study were mostly limited to life-threatening conditions in areas of high unmet need, such as cancer or rare diseases. For the study, the authors identified 163 new active substances authorized from 2012 to 2016 for a total of 180 indications, a quarter of which were granted orphan designation. Of those, 20 were authorized conditionally and 5 were authorized under exceptional circumstances. When broken up by pathway, indications with standard marketing authorization, 61% were supported by 2 or more pivotal trials, while expedited applications were mostly authorized by a single pivotal trial. Similarly, 79% of indications with orphan designation were approved based on a single pivotal trial, compared to 33% for non-orphan indications. The authors also found that authorizations based on a single pivotal trial varied significantly by therapeutic area. Thank you for listening to Quicksand, Episode 5, November 13th, 2017.